The bell above the door jingled as Jack walked into his pizza shop. His movements were deliberate, measured, as he slipped past the small line of customers waiting to pick up their orders. The familiar smells of garlic, oregano, and baking dough wrapped around him like a comforting embrace. It should have been business as usual, but Jack's hands trembled as he reached for the dough on the counter. He forced himself to steady them. The last few days had felt like they were pressing in on him, like the walls were getting closer with every hour. His fingers, once so confident and strong, now shook as they flattened the dough, just as the growing pressure inside his chest tightened with each passing second. "Hey, you all right, man?" Tony, one of his regulars, asked as he waited for his pizza. Jack forced a smile, his gaze briefly meeting Tony's before looking away. "Yeah, just tired," he muttered, his voice thick with something unspoken. He had been running this place for over a decade, watching it grow from a small local business to a well-known spot in the neighborhood. But today, everything felt wrong. He tried not to think about the papers waiting for him at home, the ones with the red stamp that threatened to change everything, the ones that could force him into bankruptcy, that would rob him of his dream. But how did it get to this? He had built the empire himself from scratch. It wasn't supposed to fall apart this easily. His heart raced, but he couldn't allow himself to get lost in the panic. Not here. Not now. As the pizza oven crackled, the door opened again. But this time it wasn't a familiar face. A homeless man shuffled in, wearing a tattered coat that was at least 3 sizes too big, his feet wrapped in makeshift shoes. He stumbled to the counter, casting a glance at Jack, who had stopped kneading the dough, suddenly caught in the stranger's hollow gaze. The man smiled faintly, a quiet sadness in his eyes, before he spoke with a quiet voice that carried a weight Jack couldn't quite place. "Do you have a moment?" he asked. Jack's heart skipped a beat, and something told him this wasn't going to be an ordinary day at the pizza shop. The homeless man shuffled closer to the counter, his breath visible in the chilly air of the shop. Jack glanced around, as if expecting someone to step in, to stop the interaction. But no one did. The shop buzzed with activity, the sound of orders being taken, the hum of the pizza oven. But Jack's mind was elsewhere, locked on the stranger. He felt an unease stir in his gut. "Can I help you?" Jack asked, his voice steady, though it betrayed a hint of irritation. The man's eyes never left Jack's face. "I need something to eat," he murmured, his voice trembling slightly. "But it's not just food I'm after. It's a conversation." Jack raised an eyebrow, leaning slightly forward as he wiped his hands on his apron. "A conversation?" he echoed, his mind spinning. This wasn't the first time someone had asked for something like that. But there was something different about this man. Something in his presence made the hairs on the back of Jack's neck stand on end. The man slowly placed a crumpled, worn-out envelope on the counter, and Jack instinctively glanced at it. The seal was broken, the paper ragged and yellowed with age. His fingers twitched, a sudden, inexplicable rush of tension sweeping over him. "Take a look," the man said cryptically, as though sensing Jack's hesitation. "You'll understand why I'm here." The envelope felt unnaturally heavy as Jack picked it up, but he didn't open it yet. He was already questioning why this moment felt so significant. This wasn't a typical request for charity. There was something about the way the man's eyes shone, like he knew something Jack didn't. Jack paused, his heart pounding in his chest. The air seemed to thicken around him as if the world had stopped turning for just a fraction of a second. He felt the gravity of the man's gaze, something he couldn't shake. Every inch of his being screamed that this wasn't just some random encounter. This man had a purpose, and it was one Jack wasn't prepared to face. "What is this about?" Jack asked, his voice barely above a whisper. His hands gripped the envelope, and the tension in the room rose, leaving the words hanging in the air between them. Jack's fingers tightened around the envelope, the crinkled edges biting into his palm. The weight of it pressed against his chest, a tangible reminder of everything he had been avoiding. He could feel the eyes of the man still fixed on him, unwavering, as if waiting for him to do something, or maybe to do nothing at all. Jack glanced at the line of customers, their voices low and the air thick with the usual hum of activity. But here, in this moment, all he could hear was his own heartbeat thudding in his ears. He wanted to scream, to throw the envelope down and forget this strange encounter. But he couldn't. What was this man trying to tell him? What could possibly be in that envelope that had this much power over him? His thoughts spun in circles. The shop had been his life for as long as he could remember, the only thing he had built from the ground up, the only place he felt truly safe. Yet, lately, he couldn't shake the suffocating feeling that everything was slipping through his fingers. The financial crisis was closing in, the creditors demanding answers he didn't have. Every hour felt like a countdown, and the walls of his empire were starting to crack, bit by bit. Just open it. The man's voice cut through the haze of Jack's thoughts, as if he had been reading his mind. The words were low, but their weight was undeniable. Jack's breath hitched. He could feel the familiar tightness in his chest, the anxiety that had gripped him for weeks, a gnawing presence that grew heavier with every passing day. He had tried to ignore it, to bury it beneath layers of work and routine. But now, with this man standing before him, that pressure intensified, rising like a tide he couldn't outrun. Jack swallowed hard. He could refuse, walk away, pretend this was just another madman on the streets looking for charity. But something inside him, some instinct buried deep, told him this man was different. "Why me?" Jack muttered, more to himself than to the stranger. His voice cracked, betraying the exhaustion he'd been carrying. "What do you want from me?" Jack's heart hammered in his chest as the silence between them stretched. He could feel the weight of the man's gaze, unyielding, like a silent challenge. The envelope seemed to burn in his hand, its presence impossible to ignore. He was trapped, in this moment, in this decision. Every instinct screamed at him to shove the envelope back into the stranger's hands and walk away. But his feet stayed rooted to the floor. "I don't have time for games," Jack said, his voice rougher than he intended, the words tumbling out in a rush. The tension had snapped inside him, his patience thinning with every passing second. "I've got enough problems without getting caught up in whatever this is. So tell me now, what's in this envelope?" The man didn't flinch, didn't even blink. He simply raised an eyebrow, his expression calm, almost knowing. "You'll understand soon enough," he said, his voice so soft it could have been a whisper. But somehow it was the loudest thing in the room. "But not yet. First, you need to see." Jack's fingers twitched. He was done waiting. His mind had been racing in 100 different directions. But now, in this moment, he couldn't ignore the urgency pulsing through him. His hands, still gripping the envelope, moved almost involuntarily as he tore it open. The sound of the paper ripping echoed in the otherwise quiet shop, and the room seemed to hold its breath. Inside, there was a single photograph. An old one, faded at the edges, the kind of photo you only find tucked in the corners of forgotten drawers. Jack stared at it for a beat, his breath catching in his throat. It was a picture of the pizza shop, but it was a different time, a different place. The building in the photo was in shambles, abandoned, its windows boarded up. There was no sign of life, and beneath the image, scribbled in shaky handwriting, were the words, "This is where it ends." Jack's pulse shot through the roof. His mouth went dry. "What is this?" he whispered, his voice barely audible. "What do you want from me?" The homeless man finally spoke again, his voice laced with something that wasn't quite pity, but something close to it. "You're already at the end, Jack," he said softly. "You just don't know it yet." The words, "you're already at the end, Jack," hung in the air like a heavy, suffocating fog. Jack's mind whirled, his thoughts colliding like 1,000 spinning plates. His fingers hovered over the photograph, the image of his beloved pizza shop in ruins gnawing at him. His chest tightened, an unsettling sense of dread creeping up his spine. "What do you mean?" he managed to croak, his voice strained. "What do you know about this?" The homeless man didn't answer right away. Instead, he took a slow, deliberate step closer to the counter, his breath ragged from the cold. There was something almost familiar in his demeanor, but Jack couldn't place it. He had seen so many faces pass through the shop over the years, but this one, this man, felt different. The stranger's eyes flickered down to the photo, and then back to Jack, as though trying to gauge how much the man was ready to hear. "Your business," the man started, his voice a low rasp. "It's not just struggling, Jack. It's already dead. You're just too proud to see it." Jack's heart skipped a beat. The words hit him like a punch to the gut, a truth he had been desperately avoiding. "That's not true," he said, more to himself than to the man. "I've been working day and night. I've put everything into this place. I'm not giving up." The homeless man shook his head, a sad smile creeping onto his lips. "It's not about giving up, Jack. It's about what's been happening behind your back while you were working so hard. The debts aren't the problem. The people you've trusted, they've been plotting against you. And that photo, well, it's the future if you don't open your eyes." Jack felt a chill run down his spine. His thoughts swam in a sea of confusion. Betrayal? Who? How could this be happening under his nose? He had always been so careful, so involved in the shop's affairs. "Who did this?" Jack asked, the urgency in his voice now unmistakable. The man's gaze softened, and his voice lowered. "Someone close to you. Someone you never saw coming." Jack's breath hitched. He was too shocked to speak, too stunned to move. The ground beneath him seemed to shift as the revelation settled in. His world was crumbling, and the person responsible might be someone he trusted. The danger was far more real than he had ever imagined. Jack's stomach twisted into a knot as the man's words sank in, each one hitting him like a hammer. Someone close to him, someone he trusted. The idea clawed at him, gnawing away at the edges of his thoughts. How could he have been so blind? He had built this business with his own hands, spent years cultivating relationships, investing time and energy into the people who worked for him. But now it felt like everything was slipping away. The foundation beneath him was cracking, and he didn't know how much longer it would hold. The weight of betrayal settled heavily in his chest. He felt sick, the bitter taste of regret flooding his mouth. All the late nights, all the sacrifices, and for what? To have it all crumble because of someone he trusted? He wanted to scream, to lash out at the man standing before him. But deep down, he knew this wasn't the time. The anger would come later. Right now, there was only one thing that mattered: finding out who was behind this. He glanced down at the photograph again. The ruined shop, his dream reduced to rubble. The place he had poured every ounce of himself into, now reduced to a ghost of what it once was. Could this really be his future? The walls he had built were turning to dust before his eyes, and it felt like everything was happening too fast, like he couldn't catch his breath. "You're lying," Jack said, his voice hoarse, barely above a whisper. "There's no way. No one would." The man's eyes locked with his, steady and unflinching. "They already have," he replied, his voice carrying an undeniable gravity. "You just haven't seen it yet." Jack's heart pounded in his chest, his pulse a constant roar in his ears. The truth was too much to bear. He felt exposed, raw, as if all his past decisions had led him to this moment, and he hadn't even seen the signs. His breath came shallow and fast. He had to do something. But what? Where did he even begin to untangle the web of deception around him? Every step forward felt uncertain, like stepping into a void. The homeless man watched him closely, sensing the internal storm brewing within Jack. "You can't fix what you don't acknowledge," he murmured softly. "But you're running out of time." The cold reality of the situation crashed over Jack. He wasn't just fighting for his business anymore. He was fighting for his future, and he couldn't afford to lose. The man's words lingered in Jack's mind, a constant echo of everything he had failed to see. But now, something had shifted inside him. The weight of the betrayal was still heavy, still raw, but a spark of determination ignited deep within his chest. He could feel it, that pull to fight, to make things right. This wasn't the end. Not yet. Jack's eyes drifted over the shop, taking in the familiar faces, the pizza ovens, the cluttered counters, everything that he had worked so hard to build. It wasn't perfect, but it was his. And it wasn't over. He wasn't gonna let it end like this. His fingers tightened around the photograph again, and for the first time he didn't feel fear. He felt anger, yes, but more than that, he felt clarity. He had been blind, wrapped up in his own fight to survive, to stay afloat, but he hadn't been paying attention to the very people he trusted the most. The ones who had been undermining him behind his back. But that was about to change. "I'm not just going to sit here and let this happen," Jack muttered, more to himself than anyone else. He stood straighter, the weight of the moment settling into him like a heavy armor. "I'm going to fix this. I'll find out who's been doing this, and I'll make sure they don't get away with it." The homeless man nodded, his gaze softer now, like he knew this was the turning point Jack needed. "It's not too late," he said quietly, "but you have to act fast. Don't let them win." Jack turned away, his thoughts racing. His first step was clear. He had to confront the people who had been closest to him, the ones he trusted. But even more pressing, he had to reclaim control over his business, over his life. There were no more excuses. As he walked toward the back office, a sense of urgency surged within him. But there was something else now, something that hadn't been there before. Hope. It wasn't going to be easy. There would be obstacles, battles to fight, and things he couldn't undo. But for the first time in a long time, Jack felt like he had the strength to face whatever was coming. He was done being a passive bystander. He was going to take back what was his. The evening settled over the pizza shop, the last customers filtering out into the night. Jack stood behind the counter, alone now, the weight of the day pressing down on him. The fire in the pizza oven still glowed, but it felt like a distant warmth compared to the storm raging inside him. He hadn't wasted any time. He'd spent the past hours digging into the financials, reviewing every transaction, every account, every person who had been a part of his business. And now he knew who had betrayed him. The revelation hit like a freight train, but Jack didn't flinch. There was no room for hesitation anymore. It was time to face the truth. His heart pounded as he grabbed his coat and headed for the door. The night air was cold, biting, but it was nothing compared to the chill that had settled in his bones. He wasn't running anymore. He was going to confront the people who had betrayed him, starting with Carl, his trusted manager, the man who had been skimming from the business for months, draining it from the inside. Jack arrived at Carl's apartment, the building dark and quiet, with only the sound of his own breath filling the air. His hand shook slightly as he rang the doorbell, but he steadied himself. He couldn't afford to back down now. This was the reckoning. Carl opened the door, his face pale as he saw Jack standing there, eyes cold and resolute. "Jack?" Carl's voice faltered, his eyes shifting uncomfortably. "I didn't think you'd find out." "I know everything," Jack said, his voice steady, his gaze unwavering. "And I'm done letting you destroy everything I've worked for." Carl opened his mouth to protest, but Jack cut him off. "There's no excuse for what you've done. You've been stealing from me, from the shop we built together." Carl's face crumbled, and for a moment, Jack almost felt pity. But then he remembered everything that had been at stake. The sleepless nights, the anxiety, the dreams that had almost slipped through his fingers. "I'm not going to let you take this from me," Jack said, his voice firm, the finality in his words clear. "You're done here." Carl didn't argue. He lowered his gaze, defeated. Jack turned on his heel, walking away with the weight of the decision heavy on his shoulders, but the smallest flicker of relief starting to take hold. He had faced the truth, he had made the hard choices, and now he could begin to rebuild. There were still battles ahead, still obstacles to face, but Jack knew one thing for sure. He was no longer a passive spectator in his own life. He was taking control one step at a time. The road to redemption wasn't easy, but it had begun, and that, for the first time in months, made all the difference. Days passed in a blur of long hours, phone calls, and meetings as Jack worked tirelessly to clean up the mess left by Carl's betrayal. He had reported the thefts, filed the necessary paperwork, and began the painful process of rebuilding not only the business but his trust in the people around him. The weight of everything he had lost still lingered, but there was a quiet determination now. His actions had set things in motion, and although the process would be slow, Jack could finally see the path forward. One afternoon, as the sun dipped low, casting a warm golden hue over the small pizza shop, Jack stood by the window, looking out at the bustling street. The world seemed to move in slow motion, the noises of the neighborhood a distant hum. His shop was still there, still standing. It wasn't perfect. There were cracks to mend, both in the business and in himself. But it was his. He was fighting for it. He turned to the counter, seeing the familiar faces of his staff preparing for the evening rush. There was a new sense of purpose in their movements now, as if they, too, had felt the tremor of the past few days. The weight of their own struggles and doubts had been exposed, but together, they were learning to move forward. Jack smiled, a quiet, almost imperceptible acknowledgement of how far they had all come. As he walked to the kitchen, he passed the same worn-out photograph of the shop, the one the homeless man had shown him. Now, he no longer saw it as a symbol of decay. Instead, it was a reminder of what he had to fight for. His eyes lingered on it for a moment before he tucked it back into the drawer. The future was still uncertain, and there was more work to do. But for the first time in a long while, Jack felt a sense of peace. He was no longer burdened by blind trust or the crushing weight of denial. He had faced the hardest truth of all, that he had the power to change, to rebuild, to rise above. And as the night settled in and the shop filled with the warmth of laughter and chatter, Jack knew one thing for sure. He was ready for whatever came next.